Under brush type, there is the default is the simple circular brush, which we have already started using. But then you have other options such as alpha brush or pattern brush. So these options allow you to choose a texture. So if you click on one of these options, under texture, any of the textures in your project, which we have already because we have the starter kit, but if you were to bring in textures from an external program, you could create a sort of a brush pattern in Photoshop or something, and then bring that in and use that brush to start painting on. The texture mode has auto rotate, so that means that as I start moving my brush around, the texture is rotating. But if we turn that off, then the brush locks in at a specific rotation, which I can set. And then, of course, the brush size will affect the size of this brush. The strength is the other one that at the moment it's got a 0.3, which is a pretty low strength. But if we turn that up to 1, then a small click will raise the ground higher. Obviously, the checkerboard pattern is not an amazingly organic or natural look. So if you wanted to make full use of this tool, you would probably want to go into an external program and create your own specialized brushes, or perhaps use something built in that's a little bit more organic, although even this doesn't look amazing. You'd probably want something with a faded edge. So I'm just going to undo all of that because I don't really like it. And then next to the alpha brush, which is a kind of stamp tool, so think of it as this texture you're just stamping onto the terrain, is the pattern brush. What this pattern will do is similar to the alpha brush, but it sort of locks in the pattern. So what that means is at the moment the scale is really, really high. So I'll have to turn this texture scale way down to see what happens. But with this checker pattern, as I move my brush around, the texture itself doesn't move. So if you had a pattern that was repeatable that you wanted to paint on, for instance, if you had height mapped a desert dune or something and you wanted to paint on those desert dunes, you could use this tool for that. This is probably a little high, so let's say 0.05. And now as I move my brush around, the pattern itself stays the same throughout the world. So if I wanted to, so let's choose something a little bit more organic. I see there was some water in there. This isn't how you create water. I'm just using this brush as an example. So now painting this way, I can use this this texture, which the pattern repeats, to create an interesting kind of terrain that way. Huh, that's actually not interesting. No, not too bad. The last type of brush on the far right-hand side of this brush type is the component brush, which allows you to raise or lower a whole chunk of landscape at once. So a whole section. I've never used this before. I don't know what it is for. If you can find a use, then great. But I usually stick to the first 3 types. In fact, in general, the alpha brush and the pattern brush are very specific use cases. And if you have a texture that you want to paint onto a landscape, then it's a great use case for that. But the brush type, the sort of simple circular brush is a great all-rounder. And if you don't want to worry about having to bring in textures and use those textures, then you don't have to. And the circular brush is quite versatile in itself. Then there's a couple of fall-off patterns, which you can explore in your own time. Just create different different fall-offs of the brush. So something that's really sharp or something that's a little bit softer. Right, below the brush types, there is the tool strength, which you've seen already. A tool strength of 1 is very quick, builds up the terrain quite quickly, whereas something like 0.1, you have to be a lot more deliberate with your brush strokes to build that up. And then the brush size. The maximum that you can slide to is 8,000, and that's, again, in centimeters. So this is a brush that's painting 81 meters of landscape at a time. But you can, if you really want to, type in a number that's higher. So let's double that, and now we have a brush size that's double that. Do be aware, though, that the larger your brush size, the more processing it takes. So if you have a really, really giant brush, then your computer is going to probably slow down quite considerably as you start painting things around. And then, yeah, the fall off just gives you a harder edge or a soft edge. All right, so let's set the brush back to something more manageable. If you ever lose track of the original default values, you can always click these reset arrows on the right, and that'll set each value back to its default. The final option here is Clay Brush. So Clay Brush, according to the documentation, allows for an organic additive approach to sculpting your landscape, similar to working with digital clay. And I don't exactly know what that means. I don't really use the clay brush very often, but just to demonstrate the differences, if we take the Sculpt tool and draw a line, let's just draw a line across as smoothly as I can. It sort of just it applies that line evenly throughout. Whereas if I use the clay brush and draw that same line, it's kind of building up as I draw along. So I think that the clay brush is adding to the position that you are currently drawing on. So if I were to clay brush onto this steep gradient over here, it would add the clay at that angle. I don't really use it that often, but it might be something that you find worthwhile. All right, so there we are on the Sculpt tool. That's just the first of the many possible tools that we have available to us under this Sculpt tab. So the Sculpt tool allows us to basically raise and lower terrain using our mouse as a brush of various types, so either this simple circle or our own sort of textures. The next option is Erase, which is quite straightforward. If we drag the Erase tool over a specific part of the terrain, it will undo the changes that we've made there. So this could be useful for kind of carving out valleys into a mountain, or just undoing your progress that you've done if you want to restart but don't want to start entirely from scratch. The Smooth tool is also something that's pretty straightforward. It allows you to use patterns as well, but I'll just use the simple brush for demonstration purposes. This also gives us the option to adjust the strength, and in simple terms, the Smooth tool, as we move it over the terrain, it will keep, actually the tool strength is probably a little high, so let's set it to 2.1. This will smooth out and average the details that we've painted. So over here, we've got some really sharp edges which don't work well on the landscape. So if I were to smooth those out, it sort of keeps the general shape, but smooths things out a little bit. There are some more advanced options, such as the kernel radius. If you hover over that, it says that higher values smooth out bigger details, lower values smooth out smaller details. So if we take this section over here and smooth out the bigger details using higher values versus smoothing out the lower details. So if you have a small radius, then you'll keep big shapes. So it's trying to maintain the sharpness of these hills, but smooth out some of the more jagged details, whereas the higher radius will sort of smooth out big bumps and try to keep the small details intact. Your mileage may vary on that. The Smooth tool is in general a really broad brushstroke tool, and it'll just try and smooth out everything that it can in your scene. I find the Smooth tool most useful when I have really sharp edges that occur. So we don't, because of the resolution of our scene, we can't really get a smoother edge than this. So it can be helpful to use the Smooth tool to kind of just smooth out those sharper edges and have a smoother landscape. All right. Flatten is another one that comes in useful from time to time. It's kind of like Erase, except you can choose the area to flatten from. If you click down on a certain level, then it will flatten, as you start dragging the mouse around, it will flatten everything else around it to that level. So for instance, let's say let's click on the top of this little jagged peak over here. And now as I move my mouse around, it'll flatten everything else around it to that jagged peak. Similarly, if I now sample from the bottom over here and click down and then drag my mouse around, it will flatten everything to that level. So if you wanted to create a really stepped world with lots of cliffs that sort of progress off each other, like steps, stairs, this is a useful tool for that. As with the others in this tool, there are some very specific tool settings which you can play around with in your own time. But in broad terms, this flatten tool takes a sample of the height of where you click down, and then as you move around, it tries to move everything else to that height. Ramp is one that I don't use that often, but it can have some very specific use cases. So you set the width of the ramp. In this case, it's going to be 20 meters, and then you click once to set the beginning and twice to set the end. And now you have a ramp that starts from where you first clicked and ends where you last clicked. And there is a gizmo on the end of that, which allows you to raise or lower the end of that ramp. And once you have set the desired slope and the desired width, you hit add ramp, and it will create exactly that, a ramp in this location. So let's undo that and try it again, and it will override all of the other stuff in between those two areas. So in this case, I will create a ramp from that area down there to this area up here, hit add ramp, and it'll create a nice little ramp between those two sections. So this is a useful tool for level design, making sure areas are accessible from one another, but it is pretty rudimentary in that there are not many options to play around with, and it will create a single straight ramp from one place to the other. All right, the next tool is erosion. If you hover over that, it says simulates erosion caused by the movement of soil from higher areas to lower areas. So this is sort of natural erosion over really long periods of time. So for instance, I've got this very unrealistic sharp cliff over here. And if I use the erosion tool on it with just the default settings and start to move my mouse, you can see that the sand is moving from the top to the bottom, and it's kind of creating these sloped gradients. And as I move it around more and more, it kind of creates these valleys throughout, and these natural ridges that are caused just by the natural movement of soil from high areas to low areas. There's a lot of different settings that you can play around with here. I won't go through each of them. If you hover over each of these settings, it will give you information about what that setting does. The one that could be most pertinent to you is noise scale. Noise scale will change the scale of the noise applied. So if you wanted a really bumpy, ridgy kind of erosion, let's just create a new, let's go to the Sculpt tool, create a new area to use this erosion tool on. Easy. Yeah, there we go. That's good enough. Where are we? Erosion. So if we want it, the default is 60. So that creates a pretty decent, ridginess to this erosion. But if we wanted something really bumpy, we might move that up to something like 20, or even let's go 10 and see. You can see now there's a lot more crags and ridges in this erosion. Whereas if you chose something higher, like 120, then just undo a bunch of that. Then the erosion is a lot smoother than it was before. And you can what I find really fun about this tool is you can already begin to see a little bit of a dune shape forming as the sand moves from the top of the dune to kind of the bottom of the dune, simulating that movement over time. I'll let you play around with the other settings in your own time, but you can get some really nice organic looks using different setups of this erosion. Right next to erosion is hydro erosion, which is similar, but this simulates the erosion caused by rainfall, so water over time, which means that you will get a little bit of a different look. So if we use this erosion, so if we use the default settings for this on this mess over here, you'll see that we start to get a lot of a different look. And if you sort of paint over this for enough time, basically what begins to happen is that you get valleys forming. So valleys and holes where the water is accumulating, and as more water accumulates in that area, more of that area is eroded. So This can be hit or miss because you start to get some really weird holes in your terrain, but that's just the way that the cookie crumbles in some cases. And if used sparingly, the hydro erosion tool can also help create a quite interesting organic look in certain areas of your scene where perhaps there's a little bit more rainfall than others. This tool you have to be kind of careful with because it is a very compounding tool. So here I've got a little bit of erosion, but if I keep going over it, it's just going to compound on the erosion that it's already created, which is how it works in the real world. And I can create some really gnarly looking terrain if I'm too heavy-handed with that. Just like normal erosion, this tool has a lot of settings to play around with, and if you hover over each of them, it tells you what it does. The only way that you can really understand how that works is to start exploring it by yourself. Okay, and then the final tool that I want to talk about is the noise tool, which basically allows us to add, subtract, or both random noisiness to the scene. So let's take a look at a tool strength of 1 with a noise mode of both. That's going to both add and subtract noise to our scene. With a scale of 128, let's take our brush, start drawing around and see what happens. So this is creating divots in some areas and mountains in other areas. And if you look at it from a sort of distance scale, so let's increase the brush size. Oops, it's kind of doing both. It's doing some areas are raising up and some areas are lowering down. And that's kind of what noise is. Noise is a smooth variation, a change in value over time. What I've found is that the tool strength of 1 is way too high for noise. I'm going to undo everything I've done there and set that to like 0.01 maybe, because it really accumulates quite fast. And now if I draw over here, you'll see that I'm getting a lot more of a noisy terrain, but it's not building up way too quickly. So I use the noise tool a lot just to add a little bit of extra subtle detail, because even if I have something that's supposed to be a really flat ground, unless you're talking about something like salt flats, it's not going to be 100% flat, and there's always going to be some sort of variation in it, and a little bit of noise detail can go a long way to create that sort of realism and interesting visual aesthetic. If you wanted something like mountains, what you could do is set your scale really high. So, I don't know, 500, that's probably too much. And then set your brush scale also really high, so something like 8,000. And then in the distance, just start, maybe 0.01 is too low for that, but 0.05. Okay, yeah, 500 is way too high. So let's go 200. And this way you can start painting on some kind of rudimentary, but still good enough for the distance mountain ranges using just the add noise tool. And then similarly, if you wanted some kind of like water body, but you didn't want it to be a very sort of smooth surface, you could do the same thing and apply, let's go back to 128. And apply this noise tool, and this will subtract over time, but it'll not in the smooth way that the Sculpt tool does, in a much more kind of noisy way. And again, this scale can be used to make your noise really detailed. So a low scale will mean that your noise is very, very detailed. This can work in some cases, but do be careful with really intricate detail on your landscapes because we are limited by resolution. Up close, you can start getting pretty, let's just move back to select, you can start getting pretty noticeable, jagged, chunky edges. So with the landscape tool, you generally want to be kind of subtle with your variations. So what I might do in this case is go to my landscape tool, hit smooth, and just smooth this out ever so slightly. And now I keep the general look of that, but I've gotten rid of all the jaggy details. Jaggy edges. Great, so that's the noise tool. It can be super useful, even if you've sculpted your nice little mountain, just to come in here with a little bit of noise and a very low tool strength. It can be subtle, super subtle, and just add a little bit of bumpy detail to whatever you've done. to help break up the smoothness a little bit. All right, and that's pretty much it for the tools that are going to be most useful for this course. The other ones on the Sculpt menu are sort of much more specific use cases and outside of the scope of this course, so I'm not going to worry about them too much. Obviously, you're welcome to go off and explore the documentation by yourself, but for the purposes of this class, from Sculpt to Noise are the tools that are going to be most useful for you to be able to shape your landscape to the way that you want it. All right, at this point, I think I will leave you to explore and find your own reference. All right, so that's it from me for now for this video. I will leave you to explore the landscape tool on your own. I suggest that you go out and find some reference images of interesting landscapes and try to recreate them as best you can using these tools that we've covered today. In the next video, we'll dive into how to start painting colors and textures onto your landscape so we can get rid of this checker pattern and start replacing it with something a little bit more interesting. Until then, though, take care. Hello, everyone. One last thing that I forgot to add as you begin to explore your own landscapes is that it is super helpful to use references, scale references. So we already covered a little bit of that by bringing in the 1 meter cube at the beginning of this video. But sometimes a 1 meter cube just doesn't cut it, and it can be helpful to have a more human scale reference. So what I like to do is bring in the Unreal Engine mannequin and use that as a reference for the scale of my landscapes. All right, so to do that, what we're going to do is go to the content browser and then select the content of your project. So that's going to be under all and then content. And then with that selected, hit add. If you don't have that selected, it won't work. So you need to select content and then hit add. And right at the top is going to be add feature or content pack. And I'm going to choose the third person because this comes with a human scale mannequin that we can then use for the references in our scene. So I'll hit add to project and let that download and do its thing. And then we'll now have a couple of extra folders in our content browser. Characters, level prototyping, map, starter content, third person. You can ignore pretty much all of it for now. But if you go to characters and then under either UE4 mannequin or mannequins, meshes, you'll have a couple of different options to add Manny or Quinn. Let's add Manny. Just drag that into your scene. Might take a while to process. Once that's done, you should be able to drag a Manny into your scene and place him somewhere. And now we have a human scale reference for our landscapes. And this is super helpful if you're creating a river or a path or a mountain or something to understand the size differences between something that is a human scale in your project and then the rest of your landscape, especially if you're making something that's supposed to be for a player that is a human size or for a film where you're going to be filming humans and that sort of thing. All right, so now with your 1 meter block and your human reference model, now you should be well positioned to start exploring the landscape references that you've brought in and trying to recreate those images. So that's all from me for now. In the next video, we will talk about adding some textures and colors to your landscape so that we can get rid of this checker pattern. But until then, take care.